tents of Shem. And it's a topic that we kind of stumbled on when we were working on a study of the Canaanites. We were working on the judges. And of course, the theme of the Canaanites keeps coming up over and over again when we look at the judges. And the idea always seems to be driving out the Canaanites. And at the time, we were familiar with a passage in Genesis chapter 9, which talked about Canaan. Really the first place that Canaan is mentioned in the scriptures. And it talks about Canaan being cursed. But the whole idea of what was being said there in Genesis chapter 9 was really foggy to me. And I found that the context around Genesis chapter 9, around the verses that talk about Canaan, was also pretty confusing. So it was an important verse to look at, or they were important verses to look at, because that's where Canaan is mentioned first. And so it seemed like it made good sense to try to spend some time and to try to figure out what was happening. It's actually a prophecy that's given by Noah. It's the only words that are spoken by Noah, and he mentions Canaan in that prophecy. So Canaan, as you may know, is Noah's grandson. He was Ham's son. But as I read through the passages in Genesis chapter 9, I couldn't understand why he was cursed. It was clear that it made perfect sense that the Canaanites would be cursed, because the Canaanites are really the bad guys of the Old Testament. And so when we think of the Canaanites, for them to be cursed, that made a lot of sense. And then right next to the Canaanites being cursed, there were a couple of blessings. There was a blessing given to Shem. Shem was another, of course, of Noah's sons. And then there were some really positive things said about Japheth, which was the last son of Noah's that's mentioned in that section. So it felt like there was something really important going on there. And so we dug deeper and deeper to try to understand this concept of why Canaan was cursed. So our goals tonight are really to take a look and to spend some time together digging into this. So our first goal tonight is to find out, what is this curse of Canaan? And then once we've figured out what the curse is then we're going to try to understand the blessings that are given to Shem and to Japheth. So come with me then to Genesis chapter 9. And at the end of the chapter, we have these words recorded by Noah. And Noah and his family at this point in time have come out of the ark. They've set up a new life. And years have passed since the flood happened, because now they actually have adult grandkids. And in Genesis 9, let's make a little adjustment here. Genesis 9 and verse 20, it says, "And Noah began to be an husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent." Now, we know Noah, and we know that that's not like Noah's character to do something like this. We find that Noah is in this state. And then in verse 22, we read, "And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness." And you'll notice the idea there that it says Ham, the father of Canaan. So Canaan is put here for a reason. It doesn't seem to fit the context. It doesn't seem to fit with what's going on here. But we're told that Ham, who's the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and he told his two brethren without. So something had happened, and Noah was drunk, and Noah was naked. And somehow Canaan plays into this just by the mention of his name here. So Ham saw the nakedness of his father, and he told his brothers. Then we come down to verse 23, and it says, "And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and they went backward, and they covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness." So when we think about nakedness in the scripture, what does nakedness usually refer to? Well, nakedness, we think of Adam and Eve, probably. We think of the fact that when they sinned, they realized that they were naked. We think about nakedness as being flesh that's uncovered, or sin that's uncovered. So you've got this connection between nakedness and sin. And we're told that Japheth took a garment and he covered, Shem and Japheth took a garment and they covered their father's nakedness. So they both covered his sin. And through the course of this prophecy that's given by Noah, they'll both be blessed for doing that. They'll be blessed for covering sin. All right. Verse 24. Then verse 24 says, and Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren. And reading through these verses, it's just really strange because it seems to be saying that Ham did something to his father and that Canaan is cursed. So why did Noah curse Canaan and not Ham? I think is the logical question that we all come to when we read through this. It just doesn't seem to fit well with the situation. And why the earlier mention of Canaan, right? Well, if we look at this idea here of this younger son, this word younger son in verse 24, so it says, and Noah awoke from his wine and he knew what his younger son had done. This word younger means little, it means younger, it means youngest, and it can refer to a grandson. So if we were to read verse 24 again, we might read it something like this. And Noah awoke from his wine and he knew what his younger son, or we might read it as his grandson, Canaan, had done unto him. Now, I think that makes more sense. And since the Hebrew allows for either translation, that seems to be the more logical one to choose. Just a couple of other references that we use to support that. There's a quotation from the Christadelphian magazine from 1910, and it says, the expression in the Hebrew is literally his little son. That is his grandson, Canaan, and not Ham. And one more we'll look at is just what Rotherham's comments on this. Rotherham says, undoubtedly Canaan and not Ham. And then Rotherham gets a little bit poetic here, but he says, Shem and Japheth for their piety are blessed. So for covering the nakedness of Noah, they're blessed. And Canaan, for some unnamed baseness, is cursed. And Ham, for his neglect, is neglected. So Ham doesn't do anything to cover the nakedness of his father. Shem and Japheth do. Ham is there's really nothing said about Ham as a prophecy here. Shem and Japheth are blessed. And Canaan, for something that he did, which we don't know what it is cursed for what he's done. So it's logical then that it's talking here about Canaan, and that Canaan is the one who's connected with the nakedness of Noah. Canaan is the one that did something to his grandfather. All right, so what's this curse all about? Verse 25 says, and he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren. So why would Noah curse Canaan for what he had done? And we don't have the luxury of knowing the details of what happened. I don't think that's actually really important. But if we're putting ourselves in Noah's shoes, Noah had seen God destroy almost all of mankind because of its wickedness. And now that same wickedness is creeping back into his own family. And so Noah takes the opportunity to set the record straight about the path that's chosen by Canaan and about what he's done. And he's showing not only what will happen to Canaan, but will happen to those who follow the example of Canaan, that they will be cursed. Verse 25 then says, he shall be cursed, he said, cursed be Canaan. And then it says, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. A servant of servants. Now, one commentary that I looked up in this says that this could be translated as a servant reduced to the lowest degree of bondage and degradation. So this is the lowest of servants that he's talking about here. Canaan is going to be the lowest of servants to his brethren. He's not going to be a ruler. Canaan is going to be one that is ruled over. He'll have to be educated, directed, judged, and corrected by his brothers. there's an echo here, right? There's an echo about this brother being the servant of another brother. So who was told of her two sons that the elder would serve the younger? And of course, the answer is Rebekah was told that, wasn't she? Come with me to Genesis chapter 25. So Rebekah had this struggle going on. She's got Jacob and Esau in her womb, and they're struggling going on inside of her. And so God explains to her what's happening in Genesis chapter 25. It says, "And the children struggled within her, and she said, 'If it be so, why am I thus?' And she went to inquire of Yahweh. And Yahweh said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels." So 2 manner of people he's talking about here are going to come from your womb. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. Now we know what happens. We know that the rest of the story. Esau is going to be weaker than Jacob. Esau is going to be the servant of Jacob. And they each represent 2 different types of people. So what was God saying to Rebekah? What was she telling him? Well, we know that Esau was not interested in spiritual things. He's called a fornicator. He's called a profane person. And Esau, we're told, for 1 morsel of meat sold his birthright, and that he found no place of repentance because he refused to change his ways. So Esau then was a servant. He was a servant of the flesh. He did exactly what his flesh told him to do and what his flesh desired. But Jacob was different, wasn't he? Jacob becomes Israel. And he does this, he becomes Israel because he embraced the things of the Spirit. And this is an important principle that's made for us here. The scriptures is telling us that the Israels will be the rulers over the Esau's. Those who focus on the spiritual will be the rulers in God's plan. Ultimately, then, those who choose God's way will be called upon to educate, to direct, to correct, to judge. So they'll be called upon to rule over. They'll rule over the people who have chosen to be the servants of the flesh. So that's just a quick summary of the Jacob and Esau situation. But I think this applies perfectly to our look at Canaan in Genesis chapter 9 as well. Because this is what God is looking for. He's looking for people that will focus on the spiritual. And he's going to bring those people into that purpose and use them to help spread his gospel. So if we come to another verse, we find that this is a principle found throughout really the scriptures. Proverbs chapter 14 says, "The evil bow before the good, and the wicked bow at the gates of the righteous." So Proverbs 14 and 19 fits right along with what we've been talking about. Romans chapter 8, verses 6 and 7 says, "For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God. It's not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. So then they that are in the flesh cannot please God." So ultimately, only the spiritual can be elevated by God, because human thinking is hostile toward God. And the thinking of the flesh, those that have only the thinking of the flesh are not fit to be leaders. They're fit only to be servants. So Noah is saying Canaan was going to be ruled over, just like Esau is going to be subject to Israel, because Canaan's focus was a carnal focus. But the spiritual will rule over the carnal. The spiritual will educate them. They'll direct them in God's ways. They'll correct them. They'll judge them, and they'll be their rulers. Now, think just as one more case to kind of support this idea, think of Joseph's dream. In Joseph's dream, the dream of the sheaves, right? He had his sheaf, and his brother's sheaf bowed down to his sheaf. And the message there was that you will follow my lead. Joseph was a spiritual man. He was working to serve God. And ultimately, his brothers would end up following his example and following his direction. And we know exactly how that ended up, don't we? They did bow down to him, and Joseph saved them. So this concept then really comes all the way back, and it fits perfectly what we find in Genesis chapter 9. So let's come back there. Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, it says, "And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren." And we've got a little summary chart that we'll bring up from time to time here as we put new data into it. Canaan's ways basically made him unfit to lead because sin was his master. And that, I think, is one of the beginning statement that Noah's trying to say here as his family begins to populate the earth once again. Canaan's master was the flesh, and the flesh is the lowest of all masters. And that's an important point as well. There's no lower master than flesh. So if we choose in our lives to follow King Sin, then we have chosen the lowest master possible to be the guide in our lives, rather than choosing Christ, the King of righteousness, to be the guide in our lives. All right, so we're going to come back then to verse 26 now. We've looked at Canaan. We understand the idea of him being cursed. And now Genesis chapter 9 moves on to Shem. And it says, "And he said, Blessed be Yahweh, God of Shem." Literally, if we were to translate that literally with our understanding of the names and titles of God, we would say, "Blessed be he who will be, blessed be Yahweh, the mighty ones," or the Elohim of Shem. So what he says here is, "Blessed be he who will be the mighty ones of Shem." And what he's telling us here is this: ultimately, this is Yahweh's family. From Shem is going to come a group of people that are going to be blessed. They're going to be Yahweh's family. Now, we don't have to go far in Genesis from this point to realize that that's exactly what happens, isn't it? Who descended from Shem? Who are the ones that we know of as the descendants of Shem? Well, of course, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? So Noah's prophecy was saying from Shem would come a people who would be blessed. And that prophecy came true. Abraham was of the family of Shem, and he was blessed because of his faith. And so salvation came through the Jews and through his descendants. And then it says, "And Canaan shall be his servant." So Canaan, mostly, Noah is saying, would not rise to the level of being God's people. Now, of course, there were Canaanites that did, but mostly Canaan and the Canaanites represent those people that can't get past fleshly thinking and don't rise to spiritual things. Their lives are guided by natural thinking only. And as a result, they have to be the servant of servants, and they will be the servants of those people that are Yahweh's people. And Yahweh's people will be the leaders and the rulers over them. And I think that makes really good sense with what we find there. So we're going to put that in our chart as well. Canaan shall be his servant. Let's see here. There we have it. So we have here, "Blessed be Yahweh Elohim of Shem." And through Israel, the purpose of God will be carried through the earth. That's what Noah was saying would happen here. And then that Canaan would be his servant. So Israel will be greater than Canaan, just like Jacob would be greater than Esau because of the choices that he made. Right, so that brings us then to Japheth. I put a map up here just so we get an idea of where these sons of Noah settled. So we've got Ham settling there in Africa, Shem in the Middle East, and over towards Persia, over towards India. And then we have Japheth settling there in the nations of Europe and Western Asia. And verse 27 talks about Japheth. And what it says is, "God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." And I've looked at that prophecy before, and I've looked at what we see on this map, and looked at this idea of Japheth being enlarged. what does that mean that he would be enlarged? And for a while there, I thought it's talking geographically, but just this map that we look at here shows that actually Japheth ends up with a smaller region, a smaller territory than Ham, and maybe even than Shem. I don't know exactly the square miles or the square kilometers that they would have, but Japheth's territory is not the largest by far. So what does this idea then? It says in verse 27, God shall enlarge Japheth. Well, you might have a note in your margin about what that says there, and an alternate understanding of what that means, of being enlarged. And what my margin says there is that this word enlarged means to persuade. Persuade. Now, how do we get this idea of enlarging and persuading? Well, what the verse is telling us is that Japheth's mind is going to be enlarged. His thinking is going to be enlarged. His mind is going to be opened, and he's going to be persuaded. So that's the idea. So how was Japheth persuaded? What's the idea? Well, maybe first of all, who in the Bible would the Japhethites represent? And again, we don't have to go far to get a good definition of this. If we come over to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 5, it tells us, it says, by these, and it's talking about the sons of Japheth. So it's talking about where the different descendants of Noah settled. It says, by these, the sons, which were the sons of Japheth, were the isles of the Gentiles divided. So the region of the Gentiles were the ones that were settled by the Japhethites. So really what this is telling us is that God shall enlarge the Gentiles, or God shall persuade or open the mind of the Gentiles. They'd have their thinking enlarged, and they'd be persuaded. What does that sound like to us? The Gentiles being persuaded, them having their minds opened up. Well, come over with me to Acts chapter 18. In Acts chapter 18, Paul had come to the city of Corinth. His teaching was really taking root. There were a lot of people hearing what he had to say. And he begins usually by teaching the Jews, and then eventually switches to the Gentiles. And this is a good example of how that works. So Acts chapter 18 and verse 4, it says, and he reasoned in the synagogue. So Paul reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and he persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. So there's our word persuading. So here's Paul, and he's out there persuading. In this case, he's persuading Jews and he's persuading Greeks. But there's going to be a shift here, as you see it in verse 5. It says, and when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the spirit, and he testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment, and he said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I'm clean. From henceforth, I will go to the Gentiles. So his focus, his persuading focus, switches from the Jews to the Gentiles. We're all familiar with that. We know Paul making that choice. We know him making this statement. We're familiar with these verses. Well, persuading people actually becomes the basis of what people charge Paul with when they're complaining about him. They say he's just persuading so many people, and it's a problem that he's persuading all these people. So come to Acts chapter 19. So in Ephesus, we're in Ephesus here in Acts 19, and Demetrius, the silversmith, is stirring up the people against Paul because his business is going out of business. He's having all these problems, and he wants to get rid of Paul. So verse 26, he says, moreover, ye see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia. So almost throughout all Asia, he says, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people. So Paul's persuading people. He's persuading Gentiles, and he's saying that there are no gods which are made with hands. And he's persuading people that that's actually the case. And people are believing, and people are becoming baptized, and people are coming into the truth. Acts 26. This one is my favorite one. It looks like I didn't advance the screen here, but Acts chapter 26. we think about King Agrippa. And this one is kind of one that rolls off of most of our lips, I think, pretty easily. Agrippa is listening to Paul's defense, and Paul's talked about his conversion and the purpose of his life. Acts chapter 26, verse 27 and 28, it says, King Agrippa, Paul says, King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. And Agrippa said to Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. So he's known as the guy that goes around and persuades people to follow the Lord Jesus Christ. So it's really remarkable, I think, because what Noah said was going to happen turns out to be exactly right. He said, God shall persuade the Gentiles, and the Gentiles are being persuaded by the thousands and maybe by the hundreds of thousands, and eventually by probably millions, because of the work of Christ and the work of Paul spreading that, the apostle, to the Gentiles. All right, so let's put that in our table. So God shall enlarge Japheth. He'll open his mind. He'll persuade Japheth. And the Gentiles have had their minds open to the gospel of salvation. Fits perfectly with what Noah had to say. Well, back in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 27, what else does he have to say? Now, I think we're getting really interested, because what he said so far is so on the money. Is it going to continue? And what other details is he giving us? So Genesis 9:27 says, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. He shall dwell in the tents of Shem. So what does that mean? What is he telling us, this tents of Shem? Well, I think there's perhaps not a better description of how Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, our favorite Shemites, lived in the land than in tents. They lived there as sojourners, didn't they? That idea of them living in tents is repeated over and over and over again. And it actually begins to follow through the rest of the scriptures, as this idea of people being sojourners and dwelling in tents follows its way through. So I've got a little list for us to just look at here of the different mentions of the tent in the lives of Abraham and Jacob. So in Genesis 12, verse 8, Abraham comes into the land. God's making these promises to him. God's blessing Shem, like we would expect. And it says, and Abram pitched his tent. So he comes in and he pitches his tent. He says, I'm a sojourner in this land. In Genesis 13, verse 3, 5, and 12, Lot dwelled in cities. Abram dwelled in tents. And there's this contrast between the two. Genesis 13 and 18. Abram moved his tent to Hebron. Genesis 18, 1, 2, 6, 9, and 10. Abraham and Sarah were dwelling in a tent. And that happens when the angels come. Genesis 24, verse 67. Isaac brought his wife into his mother Sarah's tent. Genesis 25, 27. Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. That's how he's described. That's his signature. Genesis 26, verse 17 and 25. Jacob dwelt in tents. Genesis 31, 25, 33, and 34. Jacob and his wives lived in tents. Genesis 33, 18 and 19. Jacob pitched his tent before Shechem. And Genesis 35, 21. Israel spreading his tent after Rachel's death. It's just all over the scriptures, not just the Old Testament, but it comes into the New Testament, this concept of these tents and these people being sojourners, looking for another city, a city whose foundation, whose builder and maker is God. So let's go there. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11, where that quote comes from. And what does it say here about Abraham and Abraham's faith? It says, by faith, so Hebrews 11, verse 8, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles, or dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob. So there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob dwelling in tents. They're the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So we have then this idea of tents representing people that are sojourners, that are looking for another country. So let's go back then to Genesis 9 and verse 27. It says, God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel, they're all focused on these tents. They're all sojourners. They're all waiting for the kingdom to come. And what Genesis 9 and 27 is telling us is that Jacob is going to come and he is going to dwell in these tents too. The Gentiles would also become sojourners. They would also become people looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. Now, for me, that's really exciting because that's us, isn't it? At least most of us are those Gentiles that have been invited into that tent, that have had our minds enlarged, that have been persuaded and have come into the promises of the blessings of Shem, come into these tents. So this concept then of dwelling in tents, as we said, is one from the Old Testament, one from the New Testament. It's one that we find that a lot of people understood, that were writers in our scriptures. Let's come over to Acts chapter 15, because the tent here, the tabernacle or the tent of David comes up. And it really feels like David understands the significance of this tent and the significance of what is said in Genesis 9, verse 27. So Acts 15 is all about the Jerusalem Council. And the concern when we get to the Jerusalem Council is, what do the Gentiles need to do to become a part of the hope of Israel? It's almost as if you were saying, what do the Gentiles need to do to come into the tent of Israel? And that's what the Jerusalem Conference is all about, is trying to work that out and try to come up with a solution for that. So Acts 15 and verse 14, it says, Simeon, and maybe one further comment about this when we come here, when this problem is looked at of what the Gentiles need to do, somehow the people are so familiar with this idea of the tents of Shem, with the tent being provided for the Gentiles, that when this is mentioned, it seems to bring a solution to the whole problem. Let me show you how that works. So Acts 15, verse 14, it says, Simeon hath declared how God at the first did visit the Gentiles. So first off, when there was no law, there were no Jews, God looked to the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name, right? That's basic stuff for us. Verse 15 says, and to this agree the words of the prophets, as it is written. And so now he quotes from Amos, after this I will return and build again the tent of David, which is fallen down, and I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up. So he's talking about bringing the Gentiles in, what it's going to take to bring them in. And he says, yeah, well, this is what David was trying to accomplish. He was trying to build this tent so that the Gentiles would have access to salvation. And so he sets it up. And he says that tent's fallen down, but it's going to be built up again, and it's going to be renewed. And why is it going to be renewed? Why is it going to be built again? In verse 17, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. So there's a real purpose for this tent. And this purpose is to include the Gentiles. And that's an important part of what we find here. So come with me to Isaiah chapter 54. Just another one that I think really brings it all together. Isaiah chapter 54. And as I'm reading through these verses in Isaiah 54, I have this picture in my mind of the tent that gets set up at Watchman Bible School each year. This great big tent and the stakes and the poles that go into setting it up, and all the work that goes into making this tent. And that's what this really is. That's a really good visual for what these verses are all about. So Isaiah 54, and the first three verses we'll start out with, it says, sing, O barren. And this is all about the Gentiles being brought into the tent. And the language is just super when compared to Genesis chapter 9. It's about the saints in the kingdom and how many of those saints will have come from the Gentiles. And what Isaiah is saying here is that since all these Gentiles are coming, we've got to make this tent bigger. It's almost like making that tent at Watchin just way bigger so that many, many, many more people could come. And how that could happen, I don't know. Maybe Uncle Skip could figure that out for us. But so what does he say then? Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, thou that didst not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, saith Yahweh. He says, enlarge the place of thy tent. So he says, we're going to need a much, much bigger tent because the Gentiles are coming. He says, let them stretch forth the curtains of thine habitations. So we're going to have to stretch out the walls of the tent in order to fit all these people in. He says, spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes. So we're going to need we're going to need longer ropes. We're going to need really, really strong stakes to put in the ground so that they don't pull the stakes out of the ground because this tent is getting so big. Just remarkable when you consider what's found in Genesis 9. He says, for thou shalt break forth on the right and on the left. So we're going to expand this tent to the right and to the left. And why are we going to do that? Because thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles. The Gentiles are going to be brought into that Abrahamic seed. They're going to be brought into the tents of Shem, and that shall make the desolate cities to be inhabited. So all the cities will then be a part of the promises of God and all their cities. So the Gentiles are a really big part of God's purpose. And that's what Noah was saying all the way back in Genesis chapter 9. So much so that the tents of Shem have got to be enlarged. They've got to be reconstructed because there's just so many Japhethites being persuaded that they won't fit into the tents of Shem. And that was exactly what was happening in the first century. And who was the man that was appointed as the apostle to the Gentiles? Who's the one who was bringing in all the Japhethites? Of course, it was the Shemite Paul, wasn't it? He was the one that focused on this work. His life's work became bringing Gentiles into the tents of Shem. His work was to enlarge the tent, to stretch the tent's fabric out, to lengthen the ropes of the tent that were holding the poles, to make the tent stakes strong. Paul, you might say, was the chief expander of the tents of Shem, the chief enlarger of the tents of Shem. And we stopped for a second and we said, well, what did Paul do for a living? And of course, what did Paul do? He was a tent maker. And Paul was making tents over all the Roman world at the time. And you read that and you think, well, this little prophecy is fulfilled with such detail. And the scriptures are just so wonderful when we see this and we see how great a picture God has given us of the history of the world. So let's put these pieces then into our chart in Genesis chapter 9. So Genesis chapter 9, let's see, I'll pull that chart back up. Just looking at Japheth then, the Gentiles shall have their minds open to the gospel of salvation, and the Gentiles shall join Israel as part of the family of Yahweh. And that prophecy, as we saw, that prophecy given by Noah came true perfectly, didn't it? God did persuade the Gentiles. They did have an open mind to accept the gospel. And Paul, the apostle, was the key guy that went around and made that happen. And then it says, and Canaan shall be his servant. So the Gentiles then shall be greater than Canaan. Just like what's said about Shem, isn't it? So what are we being told here? Canaan, we're being told that Canaan mostly would not rise to the level of being God's people. And the Canaanites come to represent that those that are the lowest of servants, those who are the servants of fleshly thinking and not spiritual thinking. They would have to be ruled over by God's people to judge and to correct them. And we have this wonderful prophecy about Shem and about Japheth and about the history of the world. And it just gives the utmost credibility to what Noah is trying to teach us. And Noah's warning about the ways of Canaan. And the point is that Canaan does not come into that tent in this prophecy. Canaan does not come into the house of God. Well, the scriptures say that too, don't they? Zechariah chapter 14, verse 21. Talking about the kingdom. It says in the kingdom, or it says it's of the kingdom, it says, there shall be no more the Canaanite in the house of God. That will be unacceptable. There won't be that in the house of God. So in Noah's prophecy then, the Canaanites represent those who are not blessed by God. They're not like Shem. Instead, they're cursed. They're those who don't have their minds opened. They're those who are not persuaded. They're those who do not accept God. And they're those who never become a part of the house of God or a part of God's family. Here's a definition of the Canaanite, or of Canaan. Canaan is derived from the word Cana, which means to bend the knee or to humiliate. And it's translated as bring down low into subjection, under the humble self, or to subdue. That's how the word is translated. And the Canaanites then are people who do not listen to God, who do not know the word of God, who follow the wisdom of man, and who are the lowest of servants, bending their knee to sin. They're the servants of the flesh. And because of this, they're cursed to be the lowest of servants. They follow a foolish and self-destructive course of life because they've chosen to follow a life without God. Now, this ideology has a different name than Canaanites today, but it's out there, and it's just as dangerous as the Canaanites were. Canaanites today, one form of them might be humanism. And the definition from the Dictionary of Humanism is an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. And people who follow that ideology are destined to be the lowest of servants because their master is human thinking. The humanism, the subtle delusion, says, in seeing man as the highest creature in the universe, responsible to no one but himself, the humanist replaces divine moral standards and principles with human opinions. So why do we, as humans, choose to follow human advice rather than God's advice? How has mankind gotten mostly to a place where it has chosen to reject and to defy God? Well, because Canaanite thinking is very appealing. It draws us in, and it is super powerful. And over time, Canaanite thinking can convince us with its songs, its TV, its books, its media. It can convince us that adultery and fornication and all the other things that it offers to us are acceptable and even good. And it can convince us that man knows best. Our schools will tell our children that there's no God, that there was an evolution. There's no defined right or wrong. And everyone does what is right in their own eyes. No one even thinks to listen to the wisdom of God, mostly in our world, because to them God is just a myth. But we have this divine principle then that Noah set out for us, that the scriptures has illustrated for us, and that is that we're cursed if we trust in man, and we're blessed if we put our trust in God. And we'll finish up our thoughts here with just one more quote. This is from Jeremiah chapter 17. Jeremiah 17 and verse 5. It says, "Thus saith Yahweh, cursed be the man that trusteth in man, and maketh flesh his arm, and whose heart departeth from Yahweh." And Noah's telling us that this is Canaan. This is Esau. This is those people that reject God. Verse 6, "For he shall be like the heath, or like the bush in the desert, and shall not see when good cometh, but shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness, in salt land, not inhabited." They'll never see how amazing God is. And these verses here, especially verse 6, sounds exactly like the blessing, if you will, that was given to Esau, doesn't it? Away from the goodness of God and the dew of the earth. Makes sense because Esau was also a servant of the flesh. But then there's verse 7. "Blessed is the man that trusteth in Yahweh, and whose hope Yahweh is. For he shall be as a tree planted by the waters, that spreadeth out her roots by the river, and shall not see when heat cometh. But her leaf shall be green, and shall not be careful in the years of drought, neither shall cease from yielding fruit." And then the verse that we always use to describe human thinking, which must not become our master. Verse 9, "The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked. Who can know?" We can't allow ourselves then to become the servants of the heart of man. If we do, we'll be the servants of the lowest master that there is. The servant of servants is what we'll be, and we'll be cursed. Let us then instead be persuaded by the word of God and come and dwell in the tents